In the winter of 41 CE, Roman guards cornered their emperor in a palace corridor and stabbed him 30 times. His wife and infant daughter were murdered within the hour. Within weeks, the Senate had his name chiseled off monuments across the empire. His crime? According to the historians who survived him, Gaius Caligula had crossed every boundary Rome held sacred, including those of his own family's bedchamber. Subscribe now because what you're about to hear is documented in ancient Roman texts, and it's going to get dark. When Caligula took power in March of 37 CE, Romans flooded the streets in celebration. This 24-year-old prince was the great-grandson of Augustus, son of the beloved general Germanicus who had conquered Germania before dying under mysterious circumstances. The previous emperor, Tiberius, had ruled from exile on the island of Capri, growing paranoid and cruel in his isolation. Rome desperately wanted a fresh start. Caligula gave it to them. He released political prisoners his first week in power. Men who had rotted in dungeons for years walked free. He recalled exiles, brought families back together, and abolished the unpopular sales tax. He held games that lasted for months, chariot races, gladiatorial combat, theatrical performances. The treasury of Rome, bloated from Tiberius's miserly hoarding, poured into the streets as coins and grain. The Senate voted him unprecedented powers. They granted him the title Father of the Fatherland within months. His face appeared on coins with divine imagery usually reserved for dead emperors. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived through this period, describes it as a golden age where everyone lived in happiness and delight. Then Caligula fell ill. The sickness nearly killed him. For days he lay in fever, the empire holding its breath. When he recovered, something fundamental had broken. The sources disagree on what caused the change. Suetonius, writing 80 years later, claims the illness drove him insane. Modern scholars speculate about encephalitis, seizures, or psychological trauma. But everyone agrees on one thing. The man who emerged from that sickbed was different. The first sign came during a military inspection. Caligula ordered a soldier executed for a minor infraction, then watched as the man was torn apart. He smiled. The next week, he executed a senator for speaking too freely at a banquet. Then another for not speaking freely enough. The pattern accelerated. Within months, Rome's beloved prince had become something else entirely. Caligula had 3 sisters, Agrippina the younger, Drusilla, and Livilla. Roman law and custom strictly forbade sexual relationships between siblings. The punishment for incest was death or exile. Yet according to Suetonius, our most detailed source on Caligula's personal life, the emperor lived in habitual incest with all his sisters, and at a large banquet he placed each of them in turn below him, while his wife reclined above. Understanding this accusation requires knowing Roman dining customs. At formal banquets, guests reclined on couches arranged around tables. The host occupied the place of honor. His wife reclined above him, signaling her elevated status as his legitimate partner. Below him reclined guests, friends, or in some cases mistresses and courtesans. By placing his sisters in the position normally reserved for sexual partners while his legal wife remained above, Caligula was making a public statement about their relationship. But Drusilla was different. Suetonius claims that even before Caligula became emperor, his grandmother Antonia caught them lying together when they were teenagers living in her household. Whether this story is true or invented, Drusilla clearly occupied a unique position in Caligula's life. When he became emperor, he didn't just seat her below him at banquets. He treated her as his wife. The sources tell us Caligula took her from her husband Lucius Cassius Longinus and openly treated her as his lawful wife. Think about what this means. Drusilla was a married woman. Caligula dissolved her marriage through imperial decree and moved her into the palace as his partner. At state functions, she appeared beside him. Her face was minted on coins alongside his, an honor never before granted to a sister of a living emperor. They shared a bed openly, defying not just social custom but Roman law. When Drusilla died in June of 38 CE, Caligula's reaction revealed the depth of his attachment. He declared her a goddess, making her the first Roman woman deified while her brother still lived. He ordered the entire empire into mourning. Anyone who laughed, bathed, or dined with their family during the mourning period would be executed. Senators who didn't show sufficient grief were marked for death. But the most telling detail is what Caligula did to himself. He left Rome entirely, abandoning his duties as emperor. He wandered through the Italian countryside for weeks, unwashed and disheveled, reportedly visiting Drusilla's tomb repeatedly. When he finally returned to the capital, he had grown a full beard, something no Roman emperor had done. The clean-shaven face was a mark of civilization, of Romanness itself. Caligula's grief had driven him beyond the boundaries of proper conduct. His other sisters, Agrippina and Livilla, received no such devotion. Suetonius claims he had sexual relationships with them too, displaying them publicly at banquets as he had with Drusilla. But within a year of Drusilla's death, Caligula accused both Agrippina and Livilla of participating in a conspiracy against him. He exiled them to the Pontine Islands, barren rocks off the Italian coast where political prisoners were sent to die slowly of starvation and exposure. The accusation of incest was politically devastating in Roman culture. It marked someone as fundamentally broken, incapable of recognizing the most basic social boundaries. But here's what makes Caligula's case unique. He didn't hide these relationships. If the sources are accurate, he displayed them openly, daring Rome to object. And Rome, terrified of his increasingly erratic violence, said nothing. Imagine you're a Roman senator. You've served in the legions, governed provinces, built your family's fortune through generations of careful political maneuvering. You've been invited to dine with the emperor at his palace on the Palatine Hill. You bring your wife because attendance is mandatory and bringing her signals your loyalty. You're showing you have nothing to hide. The dining room glitters with gold. Slaves move silently between couches, pouring wine from jeweled cups. The emperor reclines at the center, already watching you with unsettling intensity. You take your place, your wife beside you. The meal begins. Then Caligula's attention fixes on your wife. He stands and walks slowly around the dining couches. Suetonius describes what happens next with clinical precision. Caligula would examine each woman in turn while they passed his couch, as a purchaser might assess the value of a slave, even lifting up the chin with his hand if any woman lowered her face in modesty. Your wife tries to look down. Caligula's hand catches her chin, forces her face upward. He studies her features, runs his hand along her neck, her shoulder. You sit frozen. Every instinct screams at you to intervene, but the Praetorian guards line the walls with their swords. Last week, a senator objected to something Caligula said. They found pieces of him floating in the Tiber. Caligula makes his decision. He gestures, and your wife stands as if pulled by invisible strings. They leave the dining room together. The conversation around you continues as if nothing has happened. You sit there, still holding your wine cup, while the most powerful man in the world rapes your wife in an adjacent room. They return perhaps an hour later. Your wife's hair is disheveled. There are marks on her neck. Caligula reclines at his couch and begins speaking about her. Suetonius records that he would openly commend or criticize her in detail, enumerating her good points and defects, even in bed. He discusses her body, her performance, comparing her to other senators' wives he's taken. You sit there and listen. Everyone sits there and listens. This wasn't an isolated incident. The sources describe it as a pattern that repeated throughout Caligula's reign. Cassius Dio adds that Caligula would sometimes announce he had taken a wife in the style of Romulus and Augustus, invoking Rome's legendary founders to justify what was essentially serial rape. The message was clear. As emperor, Caligula owned everything in Rome, including the bodies of the aristocracy's women. One victim we know by name is Lalia Paulina. She was married to Publius Memmius Regulus, a respected senator. Caligula heard someone describe her grandmother's legendary beauty and became curious whether Lalia had inherited it. He ordered her to the palace. According to Suetonius, Caligula married her briefly. Rome had no concept of divorce requiring mutual consent, so the emperor could dissolve and create marriages by decree. After a short time, he divorced her but added a cruel twist. She was forbidden from ever having sexual relations with anyone else. He had used her and now she belonged to no one, condemned to celibacy for the rest of her life. Another woman, Livia Orestilla, was literally taken from her wedding ceremony. Suetonius describes Caligula attending the marriage of Livia to Gaius Calpurnius Piso. During the ceremony itself, Caligula stood and announced, "Don't touch my wife." He took Livia from the altar, married her that day, and divorced her within weeks. Later, he suspected she had resumed relations with Piso and exiled her permanently. These weren't acts of uncontrollable lust. They were demonstrations of absolute power, carefully orchestrated humiliations designed to break the spirit of Rome's elite. The sexual act was merely the weapon. The real violence was forcing husbands to watch their wives objectified, used, and discussed like property, then forcing them to return to their seats and continue dining as if nothing had happened. Roman sexuality operated on different rules than modern categories of orientation. A Roman man could penetrate anyone of lower status, male or female, slave or free, without stigma. But to be penetrated was to be conquered, feminized, unmanned. For an emperor, the embodiment of Roman military dominance, to take the passive role in any sexual context was unthinkable. Which makes the accusation about Valerius Catullus particularly explosive. Catullus came from a consular family, the highest tier of Roman aristocracy. According to Suetonius, he publicly proclaimed that he had violated the emperor and that he had quite worn himself out in the process. This wasn't a private rumor. Catullus announced it openly, and the phrasing is specific. He had violated Caligula, meaning he had penetrated the emperor. The fact that Catullus could make this claim publicly and apparently survive long enough for it to enter the historical record tells us something extraordinary was happening. Either Caligula's sexual behavior was so notoriously transgressive that such accusations seemed credible, or Roman political discourse had deteriorated so completely that saying such things about the emperor no longer meant automatic execution. Then there was Mnester, the pantomime actor. Roman pantomime wasn't like modern mime. It was elaborate theatrical performance telling stories through dance, gesture, and music. Mnester was a celebrity, famous throughout the empire. He was also barely above a slave in social status. Actors occupied the lowest rungs of respectability, legally barred from holding office or marrying into aristocratic families. Yet Suetonius and Dio both describe an ongoing relationship between Caligula and Mnester. The emperor allegedly showered him with gifts, gave him special privileges, and kissed him publicly at theatrical performances. For an emperor to have an open sexual relationship with an actor was scandalous enough. That Caligula flaunted it suggested either genuine affection or deliberate provocation of the Senate's sensibilities. Marcus Aemilius Lepidus presents an even stranger case. He was married to Drusilla, Caligula's favorite sister. The sources claim Caligula had sexual relationships with both of them, sometimes allegedly together. After Drusilla died, Lepidus became Caligula's closest companion. They appeared together constantly. Caligula allegedly named Lepidus his heir. Then suddenly, in 39 CE, Caligula accused Lepidus of conspiracy. The trial was quick. Lepidus was executed, his body dumped without burial. Caligula forced Agrippina and Livilla, who had allegedly also been Lepidus's lovers, to carry his ashes back to Rome personally as punishment. Whether the conspiracy was real or Caligula had simply tired of his former favorite, we'll never know. Finally, there's the story of Pyralis, a common prostitute. Suetonius mentions Caligula's notorious passion for her, as if this required explanation. Roman emperors weren't expected to be celibate, but they were supposed to maintain certain standards. Affairs with aristocratic women, while politically dangerous, at least stayed within class boundaries. A public passion for a prostitute suggested Caligula recognized no social distinctions whatsoever in his sexual appetite. The pattern across all these relationships is indiscriminate desire combined with public display. Caligula apparently took male and female partners, aristocrats and slaves, married women and prostitutes, possibly even his own sisters. And he did it openly, seeming to dare Rome to object. One of the strangest accusations involves Caligula's relationship with gender itself. Cassius Dio describes him appearing in public dressed as Venus, the goddess of love and sexuality. Suetonius adds that Caligula would wear women's clothing, wigs, and makeup, presenting himself in feminine attire at official functions. For Romans, gender performance was political performance. The emperor embodied masculine military virtue. He commanded legions. He conquered territories. His body and presentation symbolized Rome's dominance over the known world. To voluntarily adopt feminine dress and mannerisms was to abdicate that dominance, to feminize the empire itself. The sources describe specific instances. Caligula allegedly appeared at religious ceremonies dressed as various goddesses: Venus, Diana, Juno. He wore silk gowns in public, despite silk being considered inappropriately luxurious and effeminate for men. He styled his hair in elaborate feminine arrangements and wore jewelry more appropriate for women than for Rome's supreme commander. But was this religious ritual or genuine gender transgression? Roman emperors sometimes participated in ceremonies requiring specific costumes. Theatrical performances at imperial banquets often involved elaborate role-playing. It's possible that Caligula's participation in these events was deliberately misrepresented by hostile sources as evidence of sexual deviance. Yet the sources insist it went beyond ritual. They describe habitual behavior a genuine preference. Dio claims Caligula would receive foreign ambassadors while dressed as Venus, conducting official state business in women's clothing. If true, this wasn't theatrical performance. It was a fundamental violation of the boundaries between masculine and feminine that Roman culture considered essential. There's another possibility. Caligula was deliberately provocative. He enjoyed shocking the conservative Senate, violating their expectations of how an emperor should behave. The gender transgression might have been calculated insult, one more way to demonstrate that he recognized no boundaries whatsoever. Caligula married 4 times, but only the last marriage matters for understanding him as a human being rather than a monster. Milonia Caesonia was neither young nor beautiful by the standards ancient writers considered worth mentioning. She already had 3 daughters from a previous relationship when Caligula met her. By every conventional measure, she was an unlikely choice for an empress. Yet Caligula loved her. The sources struggle with this fact because it complicates their portrait of him as purely depraved. Suetonius, committed to maintaining Caligula's monstrous image, claims Caesonia must have given him a love potion that drove him mad. It's a desperate explanation that reveals more about Suetonius's narrative needs than about historical reality. The evidence suggests genuine attachment. Caligula would parade Caesonia before his troops dressed in military gear, breastplate, helmet, sword, as if she were a fellow soldier. He brought her to military reviews and official ceremonies. When she bore him a daughter, Julia Drusilla, named after his dead sister, Caligula was reportedly ecstatic. He would carry the infant to temples of various goddesses and place her in their laps, claiming she was his divine offspring. This tenderness coexisted with monstrous behavior toward everyone else. Caligula could dote on his wife and daughter while ordering senators executed for trivial offenses. He could be a loving father while systematically humiliating Rome's aristocracy. The contradiction is uncomfortable because it makes him human, and we prefer our monsters simple. Caesonia stayed with Caligula until the end. When the conspiracy finally came, she could have fled, could have claimed ignorance, could have denounced him to save herself. She didn't. On January 24, 41 CE, when Praetorian guards cornered Caligula in that palace corridor and stabbed him 30 times, Caesonia was nearby. The assassins found her shortly after. They killed her immediately, then located infant Julia Drusilla and smashed her skull against a wall. The murder of Caesonia and the baby tells us something important about what the assassination was really about. This wasn't justice or liberation. This was elimination of a bloodline, the complete destruction of Caligula's family to prevent any future claim to power. The Praetorian Guard immediately elevated Claudius, Caligula's uncle, to the throne. One emperor replaced another, and the sexual scandals provided perfect justification for the transition. Here's what should make us pause. Philo of Alexandria attended these dinner parties. He was there in Rome during Caligula's reign. He came as an ambassador representing Alexandria's Jewish community, seeking imperial intervention in conflicts with the Greek population. He dined at the palace. He observed Caligula directly. He wrote extensively about his experiences. And Philo never mentions the sexual scandals. Not the incest. Not the public humiliation of senators' wives. Not the gender-bending performances. Nothing. His account focuses on Caligula's cruelty, his demand to be worshipped as a god, his capricious violence. But the lurid sexual details that dominate Suetonius and Dio are completely absent from Philo's contemporary observations. This silence is deafening. If Caligula was really conducting the systematic sexual reign of terror described by later sources, why didn't the man who was actually there mention it? Philo had no reason to protect Caligula's reputation. He despised the emperor for threatening to place a statue of himself in Jerusalem's temple. If anything, Philo had motive to pile on additional accusations. Modern historian Alois Winterling makes this point explicitly. Suetonius is the first to mention the incest allegations, writing decades after Caligula's death. Contemporary sources who were familiar with aristocratic circles in Rome and well-informed would hardly have failed to mention such a charge had it been in circulation then. The archaeological record adds to this puzzle. Coins from Caligula's reign show standard imperial imagery. After Drusilla's death, yes, she appears deified, but that's the only unusual element. The rest is conventional: military victories, public works, divine ancestry. Building projects from his reign, aqueducts, roads, the Temple of Augustus, suggest a functioning government conducting normal business. Inscriptions show provinces being governed, taxes collected, legal decisions rendered. The machinery of empire continued operating. This doesn't match the portrait of an emperor who spent all his time in debauchery and sexual violence. It suggests someone engaged in practical governance, however cruel and erratic. So what explains the discrepancy? Why do later sources describe systematic sexual depravity, while contemporary witnesses focus on political cruelty and megalomania? The answer lies in understanding what happened after Caligula died. The Senate ordered damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. His name was chiseled off monuments. His statues were pulled down or recarved into other emperors. His successors needed to justify not just his assassination but the complete erasure of his legacy. Sexual depravity became the perfect justification because it marked him as fundamentally unfit to rule. Roman political rhetoric had established templates for this. Every bad emperor received similar accusations: uncontrolled lust, violation of marriage customs, inappropriate same-sex relationships, gender transgression. Julius Caesar was called every woman's man and every man's woman. Nero would later be accused of raping a Vestal virgin and marrying a castrated slave boy. The pattern is so consistent it suggests a rhetorical formula rather than independent verification. This doesn't mean everything is false. Caligula certainly did something to earn the undying hatred of Rome's elite. He executed senators arbitrarily. He confiscated property. He forced aristocrats to humiliate themselves publicly. His treatment of the Senate is well documented across all sources, including contemporary ones. But did he commit incest with his sisters? Did he systematically rape senators' wives at dinner parties? Did he dress as Venus and conduct state business in women's clothing? Or did real cruelty and genuine political radicalism get amplified into sexual monstrosity by writers working decades or centuries later, writing for audiences that expected such scandals from tyrant emperors? We'll never know for certain. The historical Caligula is gone, buried under 2,000 years of propaganda, exaggeration, and political necessity. What remains is the legend. Cassius Chaerea had served in the Praetorian Guard for decades. He had fought in Germania under Germanicus, Caligula's father. He had earned his position through military merit and loyalty. But Caligula despised him. The emperor had apparently decided Chaerea was effeminate. Every time Chaerea presented himself for the daily watchword, the password that would allow guards to pass through checkpoints, Caligula would give him obscene terms. Priapus, the god of male sexuality. Venus, the goddess of love. Sexual words designed to humiliate, to suggest Charia took the passive role in relations with men. For a military man whose entire identity was built on masculine valor, these insults were unbearable. But Charia couldn't respond. Objecting to the emperor meant death. So he endured, day after day, accepting his watchword while other guards smirked. The humiliation festered, and Charia began talking to other officers who had their own grievances. Senators who feared they would be next on Caligula's execution list. Treasury officials who had been forced to liquidate property to fund endless games and building projects. A conspiracy formed. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula attended the Palatine Games, theatrical performances held in his palace complex. The performance ran long. When Caligula finally rose to leave, he walked through an underground corridor connecting the theater to his residential quarters. It was narrow, poorly lit. The conspirators had positioned themselves carefully. Charia struck first. His sword caught Caligula between the neck and shoulder. The emperor staggered but tried to call for his German bodyguards. Another blade found his back. Then another. Josephus, writing about 50 years after the event, claims they stabbed him 30 times. Suetonius adds that several conspirators struck at his genitals, symbolically destroying the source of his alleged sexual crimes. Caligula died in that corridor. His German bodyguards, fiercely loyal, arrived too late. They killed several of the conspirators and some innocent bystanders in their rage. But Caligula was gone, and the conspiracy moved to its next phase. They found Caesonia in the palace. She made no attempt to flee. The sources don't record her last words, but we know she died quickly. Then they located Julia Drusilla, not yet 2 years old. A soldier grabbed the infant and smashed her head against a wall. With that act, Caligula's direct bloodline was eliminated. The Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, terrified he would be next. Instead, they proclaimed him emperor. Claudius was Caligula's uncle, next in the family line, and more importantly, controllable. He was considered intellectually disabled, a scholar interested in history rather than power. The guards thought they could manage him. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic. For a few hours, the dream of senatorial government flickered back to life. Then reality set in. The Praetorian Guard had already chosen Claudius. The legions would support whoever the Guard endorsed. The moment passed. Claudius became emperor, and one of his first acts was ordering damnatio memoriae for Caligula. The systematic destruction of his memory could begin, and with it, the construction of the monster we remember today. So what do we actually know about Caligula? Strip away the layers of propaganda, the political necessity of making him monstrous, the literary tradition of depicting tyrants as sexual deviants. What's left? We know he was cruel. This appears in every source, including contemporary ones. He executed people arbitrarily, sometimes for entertainment. He confiscated property to fund his building projects and endless games. He humiliated the Senate systematically, forcing them to run alongside his chariot, threatening to make his horse a consul just to mock their pretensions to power. We know he claimed divinity more aggressively than previous emperors. He demanded to be worshipped as a god while still living, something that deeply offended traditional Romans who believed emperors became divine only after death. He threatened to place his statue in Jerusalem's temple, nearly triggering a Jewish revolt. We know he elevated his sisters to unprecedented prominence. Drusilla appeared on coins, received divine honors, and clearly occupied a special place in his affections. Whether that affection was sexual remains unprovable, but her elevation violated Roman norms about women's proper place in public life. We know he married Caesonia and apparently loved her, which complicates the portrait of him as purely monstrous. He could be tender with his wife and daughter while being cruel to everyone else. This contradiction is profoundly uncomfortable because it makes him human. As for the systematic sexual depravity, the incest, the dinner party rapes, the cross-dressing, the indiscriminate promiscuity, we're left with accounts written decades or centuries after his death by men who had every reason to make him seem as depraved as possible. The silence of contemporary observers like Philo suggests at least some of these stories were invented or heavily exaggerated. But here's what's genuinely fascinating. It doesn't matter whether the stories are true. They worked. 2,000 years later, Caligula's name is synonymous with depravity. His enemies wanted to erase him from history. Instead, they made him immortal. Every generation retells these stories, adding their own interpretations, their own anxieties about power and sexuality. The real Caligula, the person who actually lived those 4 years, is lost forever. What we have is the legend, carefully constructed by his enemies, refined by generations of writers, and now impossible to separate from whatever truth might lie beneath. We're left with questions that can never be answered. Was he genuinely mentally ill? Was he deliberately provocative, enjoying the shock value of violating every norm? Or was he simply cruel and arbitrary, with the sexual elements invented by enemies who needed to justify killing an emperor? The documentary evidence doesn't exist to answer these questions definitively. We have biased sources, archaeological silence on sexual matters, and 2 millennia of accumulated storytelling. The truth about Caligula's sexuality is gone. What remains is a cautionary tale about absolute power, about how sexual scandal becomes political weapon, and about how the stories we tell about people often matter more than what they actually did. Caligula's reign lasted 43 months. His reputation has lasted 2,000 years and counting. That disproportion tells us everything we need to know about the power of narrative, the persistence of scandal, and the impossibility of separating historical truth from political necessity. If this documentary made you question how we know what we know about ancient history, hit subscribe. We've got videos coming on Nero, Elagabalus, and other emperors whose reputations were exposed by the people who survived them. Drop a comment with your verdict. Monster, victim of propaganda, or something far more complicated.